19 last week with question number 10 on that lesson. We'll be looking at Judges 19 through 21. We'll finish up the book this evening. I've asked Brother Tom Carraway to open us up with a word of prayer, and then after that we'll begin our study in Judges 19. On your way out tonight, remind you to grab next week's questions on the book of Ruth are already on the back table as you exit this evening. And then after that, our study of this quarter will be completed. The following Wednesday night, 2 Wednesday nights from tonight, we'll be in the middle of our gospel meeting with Greg Wynn. So that will be the final week, will be next week. And it is a fitting end, especially after what we have to cover this evening. This is probably, Judges 19 is probably that scripture that when you get done reading and studying it, you almost have to go to the bathroom and wash your hands and just kind of come back and just be done with that. But Judges 19 is one of those despicable chapters that really show to us how deep the depravity had become there in the nation of Israel. Now, last week we finished up with the first few verses, but let's just go through a couple of things. We're really done with this chart, but I've just left it because it's just a reminder of where we have been. As we journeyed from Judges 3 through chapter 16, we looked at that cyclical pattern that the Israelites were under through that series of oppressions to being crying out and God sending a deliverer or a judge. And then the area that we're going to be looking at, I want to go ahead and go to the next map because at least it zeroes it in a little bit for us. So when we're looking at Jerusalem, you remember the Levite comes north from Bethlehem up to Jerusalem. He doesn't want to stay at Jebus because the Jebusites are there. That's a foreigner. So he goes up to Gibeah, and it is in Gibeah that he's going to have everything transpire. And then really a lot of things go around the entire city of Gibeah and then all the cities of Benjamin tonight in chapter 20. So there's a bunch for us to cover tonight, so let's just jump right in. Last week we got to the point of just getting the Levite and his concubine to Gibeah and everything that transpired up until that point. But now we look at this. Who took the Levite and his concubine into his home, and why did he do such? All right, so it's an older man from the hill country or from Ephraim, and that would make sense for the Levite because the Levite himself is from where? He's from the hill country of Ephraim, and that is the way that he's going back. He wants to make it back home, but this is the place that he has had to find lodging for at least a night. So this man is willing to open up his home and show hospitality. One of the things is you think about the Benjamites already. What have they failed to do that this Ephraimite has been willing to do, even as a foreigner? To show hospitality. Because they had been in the city of Gibeah, but no one had opened up their home to him, and he's literally staying in the courtyard or in the square of the city. But then this man, he brings him into his home. And again, that's something that we also see in Genesis 19. Remember, I gave you that as a cross-reference. Genesis 19 and Judges 19 are mirrored images of one another, different outcomes, but still yet very similar storylines, very similar in the sense of characters and different things like that. All right, well, who wants to describe the terrible incident that took place in Gibeah? All right. No one wants to describe it, but yet we have to dissect it to a certain extent. But essentially, just as the men of Sodom fell upon the household, the men of Gibeah fall upon the household, and what is their desire? Bring out the man so that we may have relations with him. And really what we see here is the animalistic fervor that these individuals are showing, that they're manifesting here. It is animalistic. It is, they have turned against their natural functions. They are wanting to abuse this man in a sexual manner. Now, again, this is something that is well beyond our comprehension. I cannot comprehend, but what does the man offer instead of the man? He offers his virgin daughter first, and then he offers the concubine. And then seemingly, and there's a lot of things that happen here that are confusing to me, because the virgin daughter is introduced, but yet she's never talked about again. It's almost as if he goes, well, no, wait a minute, I've got another woman here that I can throw out to you. And he takes the concubine. It's almost as if he takes the Levite's concubine and then throws her out and says, look, have her. And then the men of the city do what? They took advantage of this innocent lady until she was at least to the point of death. She makes her way back to the household. She falls down at the threshold of the household. And then the Levite, and I mean, again, this is a part of the story that's hard for me to understand. The Levite did what that entire night that his concubine was out being used and abused? Sleeping. Why had the Levite went down to Bethlehem? To get his concubine to come back home with him. But yet immediately he's just willing to, he throws her out to the wolves, and then he goes to sleep. And then, when he wakes up in the morning, he walks out onto the front porch, and he tells her what? Get up. The despicable nature of this Levite, I think, needs to be manifested here. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in chapter 20, because there's some details to the story and the Levite's retelling of the story that leaves some ideas of, how terrible this really was. That the terribleness doesn't end there, does it? Because the Levite takes his concubine, he throws her over the top of a donkey or whatever it is that he's traveling with, and he makes his way back to his home. And then when he gets back to his home, what does he do then? What dramatic action did the Levite take toward his concubine, and why does he do this? Nobody wants to describe that one either. He cuts her up into 12 pieces, and then sends her pieces of her body throughout the land of Israel. Again, every step of the way, you wash your hands of this chapter. But this is showing us, I believe, in the greatest degree, how far Israel has fallen from Joshua and his elders. Because when we think about Joshua chapters 19, 20, and 21, we want to think about them as being so far in the distant future that Joshua had been so far removed. But who's talked about in Judges chapter 20 that probably tells us a timeline for this? Somebody's ministering at the tabernacle. He's ministering at the at the ark. Judges chapter 20.
Before we go to that last verse there in the last part of it, or that whole verse, it was so that all saw it said was no such deed done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak.
Mm-hmm.
That's the part that I have to think about that, I guess.
Yeah. Now, what are we thinking about?
Well, that's what I say. Thinking about what the condition the nation has gotten into is what I'm thinking of.
Okay, and because apparently they have not been doing that themselves. They have not been at all.
I think that's part of the reasoning behind him. Maybe he's seen some of it. It's just what I'm thinking. I don't know. And the dividing up and sending a shock factor.
Well, so
Them into seeing, and then this part, take counsel, consider it, take counsel and speak. Is you need to think about what's been going on here.
yeah.
That's just my thought.
All right, so we'll hold on to some of those things. Now, when we think about why does he cut her up and divide her body and send her body out like that? Is this the only time that something like this has ever been done in Israelite history? To a person, yes, but animal, no. When Saul was the king of Israel at the very beginning of his kingship, Nahash the Ammonite had come against the Israelites and came against Gilead and gave them 7 days. And how did Saul assemble the nation of Israel? He took the yoke of oxen that he was threshing with, he cut the oxen up, and he sent out the oxen in pieces and said that if you don't come and assemble with us, the same will be done to your oxen. So it seems to be that this action of cutting up a person or an animal is a call to action. It's a calling card to, hey, things have to happen. So that's something that plays into the part here.
And that's where the consider it to take counsel.
Yes. But going back to who's talked about in Judges chapter 20 that at least tells us at some point of the history. You look at it's in a parenthetical in Judges chapter 20, look at about verse 28. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, who is the son of... So how many years are we really talking about? At the most. So when we look at Joshua dying at the beginning of the period of the Judges, again, we're looking at chapters 19, 20, and 21, and we think to ourselves, because generally speaking, when we look at books of the Bible, they're chronological in order. So to be at the end of the book, it means that it's hundreds of years in the future, because the period of the Judges lasted for about 400 years. But we're not 400 years into the future. We're at the very most 100 years after Joshua's death. This is occurring. So how fast does it go from Israel being faithful to God to the point that they have to be assembled to take out an entire tribe of the nation because of this horrible act? Doesn't take very long, does it? All right. So when
Well, so if you look generationally, those who here have grandchildren, it's that generation.
Yeah, that makes you think, doesn't it?
Grandkids.
Yeah, your grandkids. There you go. For those who have grandchildren, think about this happening within that generation. And how far that would have to, you're thinking that's impossible. There's no way. That's how quickly this is moving in the sense of Israel becoming more and more like Canaan. Because remember, that's the whole premise of this entire study, is the Canaanization of Israel. All right, so looking at the assembled Israel. Why did all the sons of Israel assemble in Mizpah?
At least to request that they give unto men that were guilty.
All right, so We've got to get some information. We've got to get some information. Let's go back with me to Deuteronomy chapter 13. Because I'm trying my best to see Israel at least operating in some semblance of what they had been commanded to do. Look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 13. Let's begin at verse, someone begin at verse 12. And if somebody will volunteer for us, let's read verses 12 through verse 15. Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 12 through 15. All right. So I have some semblance of hope that, well, why did the sons of Israel assemble here at the beginning of Judges chapter 20? It's because they have some understanding that this is the way that God is to be operating. The law of God and the justice of God's law is to operate. That the sons of Israel are to come together when they've heard about something. They are to investigate that, and once it has been investigated, once those are found to be true, or this is to be found true. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 13, it's in the sense of idolatry. In Judges chapter 20, it's something vastly different, but I believe it carries the same penalty, and that's death. Idolatry carried death. Rape carried death. Gang rape definitely carried death. All of those things carried the penalty of death. So that's what they've come together to assemble and to investigate, to find out. So they come together, and when they come together, what's the number that's given to us? That should, again, something that's interesting. How many are assembled? Israelites. 400,000 Israelites are assembled. No men from Benjamin have assembled with them. Now, why does 400,000, why is that interesting? The first census of Israel, Numbers chapter 2 and at verse 32, how many were censused? The first census, Numbers 2 and verse 32, 603,550 males of fighting age. The second census, Numbers 26 and verse 51, I've got those right here, I'm cheating. 601,730 males of fighting age. So this is the end of the wilderness wandering. You have the period of the conquest, and then you have the period of Joshua's life, and then at the end of Joshua's life. So you're only talking about 120 years later, a nation that had 601,730 only now has 400,000. What's happened in 100 years? All right, a lot of war.
They're not prospering.
All right. Why would they not be prospering?
Well, they don't have the land to grow.
All right, Dan, go back to what Dan says. Well, we don't have the land to grow. Well, why do they not have the land? They didn't possess it. They didn't possess it. And Brother Frank, you said something just a second ago too. They turned from God. They turned from God. Listen to Deuteronomy 28 and verse 18 and tell me it doesn't come to fruition. Cursed shall be the offspring of your body and the produce of your ground, the increase of your herd and the young of your flock. That's in the midst of the blessings and cursings. One of the curses is that I will stop you from having children. In 120 years, approximately, Israel's gone from 600,000 plus to only 400,000.
God has sent those plagues and so forth. But you mentioned in Deuteronomy 28
Mm-hmm.
What happened to them if they turned?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we see all of these things, Israel's inquiry into the wickedness, and then how do they respond to this crisis? So the Levite gets up, he tells his story. How do the sons of Israel respond? And I want to come back to the Levites telling of the story in just a moment.
Asked advice from God.
All right. So that's one of the, this is where we're starting to see in verse 9, they say that we're going to turn it over and it will go up against by lot. And generally speaking, the lots that are cast in the Old Testament, especially from the Israelites' perspective, it's usually the Urim or the Thummim that the high priest would pull out. That's typically what we believe that they would have been doing, casting lots. And who would be behind that? Who's behind the casting of the lots? God. God's behind it. Proverbs 16 and verse 33, Proverbs 16 and verse 33, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. So here, God is behind all of these things. The Levites' retelling of the story leaves some details out that are not maybe crucial. And again, this is just coming from just reading men that are a whole lot smarter than I am, and possibly some women too. I didn't look at all the authors of the commentaries, but one of the things that is debated amongst those who's writing deeper commentary on this passage is an argument about whether or not the concubine was actually dead the morning that she came and fell at the threshold. And that there is language in chapter 20 in the retelling of it that the Levite picked her up when she was still alive, and then he killed her and dismembered her body and sent her out. The language is, well, when you look at the whole who was murdered, the husband of a woman who was murdered, the whole idea is she wasn't murdered in the sense of premeditated murder. That's the word here, premeditated murder. I just don't want to get off into the graphic details of all of that. But I'm just saying that there's an idea out there, and I tentatively lean more that way, that the Levite very legitimately may have just killed his own concubine. And it adds to the depravity of the entire situation. That's all I'm going to say on it. Probably shouldn't have brought it up. All right. Well, was there an effort to settle the dispute without war? All right. But how did Benjamin react? Not going to do it. Now, why would Benjamin react that way? All right. Arrogance. What else?
It seems to me like they're totally given over to this abomination, and they're not willing to bring it to justice.
Okay. So let's try to break this down and bring it into the 21st century. Have we ever had someone in a congregation that we've assembled with that because of a son or a daughter falling off into an abomination, and when they were approached about that abomination that their son or daughter has fallen off into, what did that mother and father do with their son and daughter? They defended them. So when we look at Benjamin doing this, I mean, for us as readers, we're kind of shocked. Why would Benjamin take the side of this atrocity? Why would Benjamin take the side of the abomination? But yet, brethren, we have to recognize that the same thing continues to exist in the world and in the church today. Blood is thicker than water. What? Almost gave you the answer. Water. What does that mean, Jeff?
It means that blood is thicker than water.
That was the most astute and just absolute best comment that we've had all quarter. I'm just going to leave that there. But we think about that. I mean, people still do this to this day. So yes, we're reading it from our vantage point, from the hindsight's 2020. We're looking at this and we're going, Benjamin, what are you doing? They're looking at it in the sense that the entire nation has assembled themselves against us. And it's us against them instead of us against sin, as it possibly could have been seen. Well, let's talk about the Benjamite army real quick. What are the Benjamites made up of? What's their numbers? A little bit above 20,000, about 26,000. And then they had 700 that were what? Left-handed slingers. And I love this. I found this. I can't remember. I'll give you I think it was Block that wrote this one. He said that it's actually been, well, I said I've got it in my notes, but that it's actually been reported that there are those that with a rock and a sling, like it said here, that they don't even miss a hair, that a rock and a sling that they can throw a stone about 90 miles per hour. And you think about David and Goliath and the stone striking Goliath, that makes sense, doesn't it? That a rock could do a lot of damage if it's thrown with that type of velocity. Here it is. It has been estimated that stones weighing up to a pound could be projected with an uncanny accuracy at speeds up to 90 miles per hour.
Really, I would think faster than that with a sling.
And it very well could be.
How fast do baseball pitchers pitch?
Very fast.
Close to 100 miles an hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got some over?
Yeah.
I mean, the average of a good pitcher, I think, is close to 100. I'm not definite on that.
Yeah.
But I would think with a sling, you wouldn't even be throwing faster than, I'm just saying.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
more dangerous than that. And a rock.
You would multiply that velocity, at least double, because of the length of the
Yeah.
sling.
Yeah, that's my thinking.
Now y'all are getting into science, and I'm going to have to turn that over to my engineer friend Jason for that answer. And it's going to be better than blood's thicker than water.
Just a point, I think. And
Yeah.
a rock compared to a baseball hitting.
Oh, yeah, I don't want that. I don't want to experience that. All right, well, let's move along. So when we look at these first 2 days, someone summarize for me the first 2 days of battle. Do y'all have any trouble with those first 2 days of battle? All right, Brother Floyd, why did you have trouble with the first 2 days?
The Israelites who were going to punish the Benjamites lost 22,000 the first day. Then the second day they lost 18,000.
All right. So they're defeated the first 2 days. Why do you think God allows that to happen?
Well, I think it is the way they have been.
Okay.
All of these have been away from God.
All right, so the other 11 tribes were not innocent, were they? The other 11 tribes were just as filled with sin and stained by it, just as Benjamin had. Now, justice needed to be served, but at the same time, one of the things that we ought to see is the progression of Israel's dependence upon God, even in the first, second, and third day of battle. Because the time the third day of battle comes, even the Lord's response to Benjamin is different. Because in our minds, when we look at Judges chapter 20 and the Lord says, yes, Judah will go first. Well, why should Judah go first in this battle? They were the largest tribe. They lived next door to them. And better yet, where was the concubine from? I can't remember. Bethlehem, which is in Judah. So they take first prize in the sense of going out. But that reminds us, going all the way back to Judges 1, when Israel entreated of the Lord in Judges 1, they asked, who shall go out for us first? And it was Judah there. But it's very different from Judges 1 to Judges 20. We're talking about a completely different type of scenario, completely different type of nation. So they go out the first day, they're defeated, 22,000. They go out the second day, they're defeated, 18,000. And based upon some numbers that we can run a little bit later, and again, I try not to do pulpit math, how many sons of Benjamin died in those first 2 days? Possibly. The sons of Israel have lost 40,000. The sons of Benjamin lost possibly about 1,000. So you think about that. I mean, already we're looking at an army that is minuscule compared to the sons of Israel. But here they're the ones that have the greatest victory at this point. But then the third day comes, and the battle tactics change just a little bit. But before we get to the battle itself, what changes between the first 2 days to the third day in their entreaty of God? All right, they inquired of God, but it's more than just inquiring of God in this third day. All right. They've wept, which is a representative of what? So weep is a representative of that they're mourning their sins. They fasted. Again, weeping and fasting goes hand in hand. It's a repentance action. But then they offered burnt sacrifices and peace offerings. And it's after that Israel has done that, now God says what to them on this time? I will deliver them into your hand. That hasn't been said the first 2 days. All that has been said is Judah go first, and then the second day was go up against them. But this time, the Lord, I believe he sees their heart turning, and as such, he says, go up, for I will deliver them into your hand. So the third day, what's the battle tactics? How does Israel turn the tide against Gibeah and against the Benjamites this third day? What's the battle strategy? Who's got that? All right, they set an ambush, but for the ambush to work, what did they have to do with the men who were there at the city of Gibeah? They had to what? They had to draw them out. They had to entice them to come out of the city. Look at verses 32 and 33. Both of those verses talk about being drawn. That same word is the same word that we used and talked about back in chapter 14 with Samson being enticed by that Philistine woman and Delilah drawing the truth out of him. That's what's happening here. So they assemble themselves on that morning, and then when the men of Gibeah and the Benjamites begin to win, they retreat just as they have done in previous days. And what do the men of Benjamin, what do they say to themselves? Well, hey, this is the third day in the row that we have got them on the run, and we're not going to stop today. We're going to go after them. But then as soon as they go after them, what happens? The city's on fire because the ambush comes upon the city. And as soon as the ambush comes upon the city, what's the signal? Is that, please tell me that wasn't a question. Well, the billow of smoke. So they set the city on fire. So then when the sons of Israel turn and they see the smoke of fire, the cloud of smoke, they know that who's going to be victorious. They are. They're going to be the victorious ones that day. But then when Benjamin turns and sees the pillar of smoke, they know what? They panic and they know that defeat is upon them. But then look at verse 35. Who defeated Benjamin? It wasn't the tactics. It wasn't the ambush. It wasn't Israel. It was the Lord who gave them into their hand. And that was what was the sign given to the ambush's success.
You know, I did a little addition. If my numbers are right, there were 65,130 men of war that died on this matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that does not include Jabesh Gilead, the ones that were killed there.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's one of the things I want to come back to, Brother Foy. So hold on to those numbers for us, because I want to come back to that at the end to just show how far depravity really. What's the old saying that sin will take you what? Further than you want to go, to make you pay more than you want to pay, and it will hold you longer than you want to stay. That's the old saying, right? And definitely this narrative event tells us all about how bad sin really is and how it can destroy our lives. All right, any other thoughts, any other talks? When you look at the numbers, and I know the numbers are difficult to decipher. Essentially you've got 25,100 died in battle, and 600 were left. Well, that's only 25,700. What happened to the other 1,000? Because the original count was 26,700. That's where I told you more than likely the first 1,000 died in those first 2 days of battle. That's my estimation. That's my opinion of where that other 1,000 is. It could have been other things too, but that would add up completely to the 26,700. All right. Well, where did the sons of Benjamin run to and find shelter? All right, the Rock of Rimmon. Does anybody have another little footnote there, possibly, for what Rimmon may mean? Is it one? What did it say, Miss Julia? The rest. So I've also got it is that it could mean the rock of the pomegranate. And that essentially what this is in the hill country of Benjamin. Back in those hills, there's a lot of cave systems, and that if you look at this particular cave system, it literally looks like a pomegranate that's been cut open in half on the side of this mountain. That's where they sought out their refuge, their place of safety. And again, that should tell us something about these Benjamites, because they did not go to Shiloh, where what would have been? Or Bethel. They didn't go to the tabernacle. They didn't go where the Lord was to find refuge in Him. They went and found refuge in and amongst themselves. So again, that tells us what type of individuals even these 600 who were left would have been. All right. Well, that brings us to chapter 21. How did the sons of Israel react to their victory over Benjamin? They didn't rejoice for very long, did they? They wept. Why would they weep over this victory, over the great sin that Benjamin was guilty of? Why would they not rejoice in that? They've completely cut off one of the 12 tribes. And then not only had they already cut off this tribe, but then they had made a rash vow back at Mizpah, which is not given to us in chapter 20, but it's given to us here in chapter 21. And what was that rash vow? Yeah, so none of us are going to give our sons to our daughters to their sons. So essentially, those 600 Benjamites are going to do what? They're not going to have Israelite children, and because of such, the tribe of Benjamin is going to cease to exist. So, we've got to fix this. We've got to fix this problem. Who do they not consult to fix the problem? They don't consult God about this. Because what was their answer? What's the two remedies? The first remedy was to do what? Who didn't come to the fight? Let's take up a count. Who didn't come to the fight? Well, what city didn't send any men? Jabesh Gilead. So what can we do to Jabesh Gilead? Killing all the Benjamites wasn't enough. Let's go kill them all. And they went over to Jabesh Gilead and they burned it down. They killed them all. They killed all their women and children. The only ones that survived was what? 400 virgins that were then taken. And then what choice did those 400 virgins have when they came to the 600 sons of Benjamin? Well, it's 400 there. And it's 200, was it? Or am I getting those backwards? 400 the first time. Because then Well, then you got 600 Benjamites and you only got 400 virgins. We got to find 200 more. So where did their wisdom lead them this time?
Well, actually, it boils down to, they can steal some of our daughters.
They can steal some of our daughters. And then if their daddies come up to us and tell us about this, what are we going to say to their daddies? Hey, do it for the nation. So you think about this. One act of horrendous violence that was contained in Judges chapter 19 ultimately brought about multiple acts of horrendous violence. Because then, not only did all the cities of Benjamin suffer, but then the suffering of Jabesh Gilead, and then the suffering of these 200 women who were coming to Shiloh to do what? It's a feast to the Lord. It's at least, the implication is that these are two young ladies coming to worship God, and what's happening to them? They're being stolen away and essentially made to be a wife of someone that they don't get to choose. But all of this ultimately brings us to the best description of the nation of Israel, and that is what? Where does the book of Judges end? In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The saddest commentary of any generation of Israel is contained right there. The promise, the blessings that could have been bestowed, none of those things are ever realized because of what they did in choosing to have Canaan over the Lord. But yet, is that the end of the story for Benjamin and the tribe of Benjamin? Who's the first king? And Saul was from Benjamin, and even better yet than that, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 11 that I made an allusion to earlier, guess where Saul is from in Benjamin? He's from Gibeah. But that's not the end of the story for Benjamin. There's another man that comes from the tribe of Benjamin that plays a fairly prominent role in the New Testament. His name was Saul of Tarsus. Wasn't he a Benjamite? Philippians chapter 3. So you think about those things here. Yes, of the tribe in Philippians 3 and verse 5. So God can still take the mess that man makes, and he can do what from that mess? He accomplishes his will. Always.
That tribe also stayed with Judah.
Mm-hmm.
When the kingdom divided.
Mm-hmm.
They continued to last longer than the other.
And typically we see Judah and Benjamin together more often. Remember, Judah kind of absorbs Simeon too. Simeon's just kind of absorbed into Judah. All right, any other comments, questions, observations on the book of Judges? Well, as sad as tonight is, at least next week we get to end on a much brighter note, and that is with the book of Ruth. And the differences between the book of Judges and the book of Ruth is outstanding. It's crazy to think that the book of Ruth is still yet occurring in the same time period that the book of Judges is just described. It's during the period of the Judges that Ruth comes along, and all of the things that happen in the book of Ruth are occurring. So there is hope in Israel even when they are so full of so much darkness and sin. Any other final comments? I appreciate so much your kind attention this evening in the study and the conversation.
Our first song tonight will be number 118, Take Time to Be Holy. And we'll sing all three verses of this song.
It's good to see each one of you out tonight. In way of invitation tonight, some of the local news, if you've had the TV on this week, you've seen a lot of news about the hurricane that's coming up out of the Gulf, and Hurricane Francine has kind of dominated a lot of the news, and I think it made landfall just before services tonight, I think around 5 p.m. 55 years ago, though, August the 17th of 1969, not far from where Francine made landfall tonight, there was another hurricane named Camille. And it made landfall just east into a small town called Christian Pass, or Pass Christian, said that backwards, Mississippi. In that particular city, there just happened to be a 3-story apartment complex that was about 250 feet off the beach. Now, most residents had been warned that Camille was on the way for some time and had fled, but there was 23 residents that they believed that the building they were in was strong enough to survive such a storm. It had survived other storms in the past. So leading up to the August the 17th, they spent their morning boarding up their windows and carrying their belongings from the first floor up to the second floor and the third floor. And there they gathered to ride out the storm together. 23 of the residents. The police came by several times during the day and tried to encourage them and warn them to evacuate. And eventually, they wanted to leave. But by the time they got to that point that they wanted to leave, it had become too bad to travel. And so about 10:15 that night, it was a Sunday night, about 10:15, the front wall of the Hurricane came ashore right there at Pass Christian, Mississippi. Camille's winds were clocked at 190 miles per hour, and that was before the instruments that were measuring the wind speeds broke. The waves surged that night to 24 feet high, flattening the entire city, as well as the apartment where those 23 residents were, leaving nothing of the three-story structure the next morning but the foundation. To this day, Hurricane Camille in 1969 is one of only 4 Category 5 hurricanes to ever hit the U.S. I think the one that came ashore just a little while ago was a 2 when it first came ashore. And news reports later showed that some of the most catastrophic storm damage from Camille came at the location of the apartment building where 8 of those 23 residents who did not heed the warning to evacuate were killed, and 89 others just past the beach there in the city of, small city at that, of Pass Christian, Mississippi. Now, I tell you that story to say life is filled with warnings. We are warned of things so that we may avoid some type of outcome, some type of consequence, some type of danger. And then it's up to us to either heed the warning or ignore it. Across the room tonight, we have quite the range of ages. But I would think that most of us either currently work for, have worked for in the past, or for the younger people in the audience, will work for in the future, someone who has cautioned us about risk and the warnings we need to pay attention to in whatever particular line of work we're in. It might be security. It might be our physical safety. It might be online security. It might be some type of scam, consumer scams or scam protections we need to be aware of. It might be equipment at our job site, some type of safety. It might be something that's hazardous to us, such as chemicals, things like that. And if we really stop and think about it, just about anything we purchase or anything we do each and every day has some type of warning it carries with it. And you know, it wouldn't be considered a warning if we weren't warned in advance of something happening. A warning is given in advance while there's still time to change our choice or a course of action. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a warning. And in all the trainings I've had to complete over the years, and it seems like there's more and more each year, we always are told not to overlook and ignore the what? The warnings, the signs. To which, what do we often do anyways? What about spiritual warnings? Would you agree that the Bible is just packed full of warnings for us? I did a quick search with some software I had there, and using only one version, I think it was the King James Version, I'm not 100% sure on that, but take heed. Would you say when the Bible says take heed of something, that's a warning? It's used 55 times. How about beware? Of course, we would consider that a warning, 28 times. Be not deceived, 5 more times. And we could go on and on and on. And sometimes when you read Scripture, you figure it out, it's a warning, and it really doesn't tell you it's a warning, but it is. Some of the ones I jotted down, just real quickly, we won't turn to them for sake of time, but Luke 12 in verse 15, take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesses. Romans 12 in verse 2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12, let him that thinks he stands, what? Take heed, lest he fall. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33, be not deceived. Another warning, evil communications corrupt good manners. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8, beware, lest any man spoils you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. One more, 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. All these are warnings. We could go on and on. Overlooking warnings can at the very least cost us a headache, right? So the number one warning I'm guilty of, do not over-tighten. Now, surely I'm not the only one in this room that has this problem, but I'm putting a bookshelf together or I'm working on something and the warning is, do not over-tighten. Well, I don't want it to be too loose and fall apart, do you? So I tighten. It's not hardly tight enough, and I tighten it some more. The next thing you know, when I flip the bookshelf up, the screw's poking right through the top, right? But overlooking Bible warnings is not going to cost us to mess up a piece of furniture. Maybe it's not going to cost us to have a headache or maybe even an injury. Overlooking Bible warnings can cost us our soul. Luke 13 and verse 3 says, except you repent, you shall likewise perish. How many times have you heard that? How many times have you read that? How many times have you ignored that? Have you ignored repenting? People who ignore warnings say, I'll just chance it. Or, I'm willing to take that risk. Have you heard people say that before? And they ignore the warning. But are you really willing to risk eternity? If you haven't obeyed God's commands, if you haven't become a child of His, I ask you to think about that soberly. Are you really willing to risk your eternity? I ask you not to make the same mistake as those 23 people did 55 years ago in the face of the Hurricane Camille in Mississippi and ignore the warnings and then have to deal with the outcome, have to deal with the consequences that come from that decision. 2 Peter 3 and verse 10 says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. You know, where I work, we have different warning systems in place for different things that occur. Some things aren't as serious that happen on a weekly basis, and we have a warning light or a warning siren or different things that will go off in the building. And then there's other things that's more serious that we have other warnings for. But did you know that we all have an internal warning system? We do, every one of us here tonight. And that's called our conscience. Our conscience warns us in advance of what we should or shouldn't do. But you see, our conscience has no power after it warns us. It can't force us to make the correct decision. So what is your conscience telling you tonight? Is it warning you? Do you need to make a change in your life? We would love to assist you. We would love to help you. If we can help in any way, we ask that you would heed the warning and come forward as we stand and as we sing.
Just as I
please pray with me. Dear Father, Lord, thank you for this day, thank you for food, thank you for all blessings you give us, Lord. Lord, be with our sons, our sick ones right now. Hope that they can get feeling better and they can come back to you